We are again recording, telling the third part of the story of building the Pennsylvania Railroad through the Greensburg, Pennsylvania area. One thing I want to point out here is that this was a huge, immense project, and all I can do is just point out a few highlights. I mean, it would take a full-length movie to even begin to tell this story. What we're looking at here is the way the fills were built, and I'll say more later about a fill. But suffice it to say here that they were just ways of raising the level of the infrastructure under the superstructure, meaning the dirt that holds the tracks, to get the correct grade level, because a train cannot pull up the kind of grades that an automobile or a truck can. They have to go over very easy grades, simply because they're pulling one heck of a lot of weight. A freight train or even a passenger train is a very heavy proposition to pull along. And even a grade of 1% is significant for them. 1% simply means over a traveling distance, a horizontal distance of 100 feet, you would have 1 foot rise, vertical. What these guys are doing here is building the fill over a culvert. That culvert has already been built to carry a stream, and they're building a fill, and they're doing it by using these little carts and filling it in by having constructed a trestle, these temporary trestles. Now, interestingly, these trestles were not constructed and taken away. They were simply buried there. And whenever a railroad fill like that is excavated, these trestles are usually still there unless they've rotted to the point of non-existence. But they are interesting from an archaeological point of view, that they can show just how the construction was done. Also interesting to point out is where all this stuff was coming from, all this dirt and all this material. It was coming from right there. I mean, the people who were unfortunate enough to have land beside where a railroad was going were incurring a heck of a lot of loss, because the railroad had been given a charter by the state of Pennsylvania to take whatever they needed to build their line. And a lot of serious damage happened, and a lot of court cases resulted. And a lot of land was for quite a while rendered useless by the fact that that dirt they needed to build the fills was scraped from right beside it. And farmers' fields were devastated from the rails, the fences, the trees. Now here we have what it probably looked like when the culverts and arch were put in over top of Jack's Run and the road that one time went up to New Alexandria and up to Salzburg. The arch to the left is still down there on Arch Street. This view looks north. Jack's Run over there is Jack's Run is here, and that is still running. And this whole thing had to be built up probably to about this high, and that all had to be done with these guys with horses and donkeys and the little carts. Now, if all is done as it's supposed to be done, this would have never happened. What happened was this arch down here was not built correctly. This is the arch up here that still carries Arch Street under the railroad. And these are the roads going to New Alex and so on, 119 and 118 now. But this culvert caved in June of 1852 while the railroad was being built. Of course, the kids were very happy about it. It made a temporary lake where they could go swimming. But the guys building the railroad were not too happy, because this meant they had to reconstruct this culvert, which was now underground, and it was a hell of a job to get in there to rebuild a culvert like that once it had fallen in. This shows how a culvert was built. There's wooden structure, first of all, built. And over top of that wooden structure is put cut stone. And an arch will hold itself up if the work is done right. And if it's not done right, well, we know what happens. And this shows where they were working. This is the arch that still takes Arch Street under the railroad. And this is the level of the railroad. And now, if you were standing right here in 1849, none of this stuff, none of that material would have been there. I mean, it would have just been a clear visual shot looking north. And can you imagine the project that these guys were faced with as they started to build these things? It was a rather daunting task, frankly. And they started in the early part of 1850, and they worked through 1851. And toward the end of 1852, they finally had a railroad going. But they didn't have bulldozers, they didn't have steam shovels, they didn't have land movers of any kind. They had horses, they had carts, and they had their own strong backs and picks and shovels. Now this shows how that was done. This might have been St. Clair Park at the time that the railroad was being built. Arch Street would have run down here, and they were getting ready to put a tunnel down here, the tunnel that still goes down there. And this is how the guys got the dirt. These are not plows, these are called scrapers. And these scrapers were pulled by a horse or a team of horses. And they collected the dirt, which was then hauled out and dumped to make a fill to run the railroad on. And when they were done, this land was very often scraped the whole way down to bedrock. And if you happened to own that land, it had been rendered worthless to you if you had a garden or anything that you considered worthwhile. This is where the guys lived. These were the shanties that they lived in. This was Charles McCausland's shantytown. And we are fortunate in that the year that these guys started building was a census year. So we know who was there. We know how many of them there were. And we know also from courthouse records that there was a lot of stuff that went on that was showed up in courthouse records. But guys who live like this don't exactly have what you call a nice, stable life, a lifestyle of any kind, hardly. They spent most of their days working, and they would come home to a bunch of shanties and hovels like this. This particular one had most likely they would have had a meal house, a place where they could eat, because they had cooks hired at this shanty town. Most of the shanty towns had very little in the way of social structure, but some of them had a basic kind of foreman type of thing. This is the fill that they were building. This dates from 1901, this particular lithograph. This is the tunnel under Arch Street. This down here is the tunnel that takes Jack's Run under the railroad. And I see we are getting to the point where we should say so long for this, because we've gone far enough and we have to say it so long until next one.